Usually the Pope produces smiles or a bubble of intimacy, but in his speech to Congress, he brought a couple of members to tears.
At the beginning of the general audience, the Pope made two announcements. One was a reminder that he would unfortunately not greet pilgrims personally because of the coronavirus. The other was a thought that came to his mind when he noticed a mother quieting down her crying baby and nursing it. He said that was the image of God who cares for every person.
Pope Francis has long been a symbol of hope and unity, but his latest speech, delivered in the presence of global leaders and the UK royals, left the world speechless. Addressing the challenges of division, poverty, and suffering, his words brought thousands to tears, including some of the most influential figures of our time. This moment wasn't just historic, it was transformative. It was a rare and monumental gathering at St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City.
Sunday, November 14th is the 5th World Day of the Poor. Pope Francis will celebrate Mass in St. Peter's Basilica at 10 a.m. Some 2,000 poor people will be in attendance. After Mass, the Vatican will distribute lunch to those present.
The sun cast its golden rays over the iconic dome, bathing the square in a warm, almost ethereal glow. Thousands of people filled the plaza, from religious leaders to everyday believers, all united in anticipation of the Pope's address. Among the dignitaries were members of the British royal family. King Charles III, accompanied by Queen Camilla, stood near the front row, their presence symbolic of a deepening bond between the Vatican and the UK. Beside them were the Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Catherine, their expressions reflecting a quiet reverence for the occasion. The air buzzed with anticipation as Pope Francis emerged from the Apostolic Palace.
Pope Francis will return to the most famous window in Rome, the window of the Apostolic Palace, this Sunday for the Angelus.
He walked with his characteristic humility, a simple white robe flowing as he made his way to the podium. The crowd erupted into applause, but he raised his hand gently, signaling for silence. His eyes scanned the sea of faces before him, lingering briefly on the royals, who nodded respectfully. Pope Francis began with a story. "When I visited a refugee camp in Syria," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "a little boy named Ahmed tugged on my robe. He asked me, 'Why does the world not care about us?'" The Pope paused, his eyes glistening. I had no answer for him, and that silence has haunted me ever since. The crowd was silent, the weight of his words settling heavily over the square. Cameras captured the faces of those in attendance, some with tears already forming, others nodding solemnly. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was seen dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while King Charles III folded his hands, his gaze fixed on the Pope. The Pope continued, weaving Ahmed's story into a broader narrative about the millions of displaced, hungry, and forgotten people around the world. "How can we call ourselves civilized?" he asked, his voice rising with urgency. "When children go to bed hungry, when families are torn apart by war, when our planet cries out for mercy." As the speech progressed, Pope Francis shifted from storytelling to a plea for action. He addressed the royals directly, acknowledging their long-standing commitment to charity and environmental causes. "Your Majesties, Your Highnesses," he said, turning toward King Charles and Prince William. "Your work inspires hope, but the task ahead requires all of us to unite, leaders, citizens, and communities alike." William nodded solemnly, while Charles whispered something to Camilla, who placed a hand over her heart. The Pope's call for unity wasn't limited to the royals. It extended to every person in the crowd and beyond. "The change we seek will not come from institutions alone," he said. "It begins in our hearts, in the way we treat one another, in the compassion we show to the least among us."
Pope Francis has called for Roman Catholic leaders to be compassionate shepherds to a wounded humanity. The message comes in the publication of a book called The Name of God is Mercy.
The Pope then called for a moment of silence, asking everyone to reflect on someone in their life who needed help or kindness. As the plaza fell quiet, the camera panned to Catherine, who held William's hand tightly, and Charles, whose face reflected deep contemplation. Then came the most unexpected moment of the day. Pope Francis invited King Charles III to join him at the podium. The crowd gasped softly, their surprise quickly turning to curiosity. The king stepped forward, his movements deliberate and his expression solemn. Standing beside the Pope, Charles spoke briefly but powerfully. As His Holiness reminds us, the challenges we face today are immense, but they are not insurmountable. Together, with faith and action, we can create a world that reflects the values of compassion and justice. His words were met with thunderous applause, with Catherine and Camilla visibly moved in their seats. Pope Francis then took the floor again, holding up a small piece of paper. "This," he said, "is a letter from a child in Kenya named Grace. She wrote, 'Will the world ever care about children like me?'" He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "Grace's question is not for me alone. It is for all of us." Tears flowed freely across the crowd. Even some of the reporters, known for their impartiality, couldn't help but wipe their eyes. The Pope concluded by announcing a new global initiative, spearheaded by the Vatican and supported by the royals, to combat child poverty and hunger. As the speech came to a close, the Pope left the crowd with a simple message: "Do not wait for tomorrow to act with love. Begin today." The crowd rose to its feet, offering a standing ovation that lasted several minutes.
Now we head to the Vatican, where Pope Francis has reportedly tripled crowds at the Vatican since he took over the papacy last year.
The British royals, deeply moved, spent time after the event speaking with attendees. Catherine was seen comforting a tearful mother who had traveled from a war-torn country, while Charles shared a quiet conversation with a refugee advocate. The initiative launched that day quickly gained global traction, with donations and pledges pouring in from governments, organizations, and individuals. Grace, the young girl from Kenya, later saw her letter featured in news outlets, sparking an outpouring of support for her and her community. Pope Francis has become a beacon of love and compassion in a world often divided by conflict and hardship. From embracing the homeless to washing the feet of prisoners,
later, Pope Francis, with towel in hand, bent down to carry out the rite of the washing of the feet, the same gesture of one who came to serve, not to be served.
his simple yet profound acts of kindness have left millions inspired and moved to tears. But these are not just grand gestures. They are personal, heartfelt actions that have changed lives and melted hearts. It was a chilly morning in Rome, the kind that makes the cobblestone streets glisten under the soft light of dawn. In St. Peter's Square, a group of homeless individuals had gathered near the towering columns, bundled in whatever clothing they could find to stave off the cold. They had come, as they often did, to receive blessings from the Vatican's outreach program, a quiet initiative championed by Pope Francis to care for the city's most vulnerable. That morning, as the group huddled together, a simple white figure emerged from the basilica. It was Pope Francis himself, walking without ceremony or entourage, his white cassock fluttering in the breeze. The group watched in astonishment as the Pope approached them, his face warm with a smile that seemed to break through the chill. "Good morning, my friends," Pope Francis said, greeting each person with a handshake and a kind word. Among them was a man named Marco, a former carpenter who had lost his home and family to a series of misfortunes. His weathered face lit up as the Pope stopped to speak with him. "Are you warm enough?" the Pope asked, placing a hand on Marco's shoulder. Marco hesitated, then shook his head. Without a second thought, Pope Francis removed his own white papal coat and draped it over Marco's thin frame. "This will keep you warm for now," he said, his voice gentle. The small group was visibly moved, but the Pope wasn't finished. He invited them to join him for breakfast in the Vatican cafeteria. What followed was a scene that defied the grandeur often associated with the Vatican. A simple meal of bread, coffee, and fruit shared between the Pope and the homeless individuals.
These are some of the Pope's most distinguished guests, 21 Syrian refugees who have been given a second chance in Rome. After, he sat down with them at the table in Santa Marta, but made sure to pray a blessing before starting to eat.
Francis listened intently as they shared their stories, offering words of encouragement and hope. But Pope Francis's acts of kindness extend far beyond Rome. On a visit to the Philippines after a devastating typhoon, he toured a small fishing village that had been almost entirely destroyed. There, he met Maria, a young mother who had lost her home and her husband in the storm. She clutched her 2 small children tightly as she explained how they had been living under a tarp, scavenging for food to survive. Moved by her plight, Pope Francis knelt to speak directly to her children, his tone soft and reassuring. "You are so brave," he told them, his eyes filled with tears. Turning to Maria, he promised that the church would provide her family with shelter and support. True to his word, the Vatican worked with local organizations to build new homes for Maria and dozens of other families in the village. Perhaps the most moving example of Pope Francis's kindness occurred during a visit to a juvenile detention center in Italy. In a gesture that stunned both the inmates and the guards, he knelt to wash the feet of 12 young prisoners, including 2 Muslims, a Hindu and an atheist. One of the inmates, Alessandro, later shared how the act changed his life. "When he knelt in front of me, I felt something break inside," Alessandro said. "He didn't see me as a criminal, he saw me as a human being." Pope Francis spoke to the group afterward, urging them to believe in their own redemption. "Your past does not define you," he said. "What matters is the path you choose now." Alessandro, inspired by the Pope's words, later turned his life around, enrolling in a vocational program and reconnecting with his family. Stories like these are countless. From quietly paying for the medical expenses of a sick child to personally calling a grieving family to offer comfort, Pope Francis's acts of kindness are as profound as they are personal. They remind the world that leadership is not about power, but about service. Years after receiving the Pope's coat, Marco, the homeless man from Rome, shared how that moment had given him the strength to rebuild his life. With help from the church, he found steady work and a place to live. "He didn't just give me a coat," Marco said. "He gave me dignity." Pope Francis's acts of kindness are a call to action for all of us. His example shows that even the simplest gestures can have a ripple effect, touching lives in ways we might never imagine. Clearly, you can see that it's not just us hyping and preaching cautiousness regarding the Antichrist. Jesus Christ, in all his magnificence and wisdom, was able to recognize the Antichrist as a future adversary who opposes God's kingdom. Such insight should serve as ample motivation to stay vigilant and resolute in our faith. In all its entirety, it's not going to be an easy journey warding off the approaches of the Antichrist. When it comes to mental fortitude, it's said that he can't be compared to any other. Compare the mental fortitude of the Antichrist to that of the tenacity of a cunning serpent, one slithering through the shadows with calculated precision. Like the serpent, the Antichrist possesses a keen intellect and strategic acumen, capable of navigating treacherous terrain with deceptive ease. Its resolve is as unyielding as the serpent's relentless pursuit of prey, undeterred by obstacles or opposition. With a cold-blooded determination, the Antichrist coils around its objectives, patiently waiting to strike at the opportune moment. Just as the serpent adapts to its environment, so too does the Antichrist adapt its tactics, morphing and evolving to ensnare its unsuspecting victims, the believers. What's the end result?
What does the Bible say about the Antichrist? And just saying those words, Antichrist or Antichrist, as some people say it, it gets people troubled in their heart. It gets them anxious, begins to make them feel funny just to consider or think about that topic.
Chaos and despair for all who fall. When you think that it's just resilience that the Antichrist has got, it's best to think again, because that's not all. Aside from resilience and psychological prowess, it is said that the Antichrist would take a perfect physical form, one similar to that of King Saul in the Bible. This means that he'll be without flaws of any kind, making him almost impossible to resist. This will make it much easier for the people to fall for his deception and manipulative skills. You might probably think right now, how can the children of God possibly spot what's to come? Well, it's easy to spot the Antichrist in trying times. It's true that he would come from nothing, build and make his way to the top, so don't be surprised or taken aback. One of the ways that the Antichrist will give away his identity is regarding his views about the Most High God. From the onset, he will speak against the Most High, urging believers to despise the Creator's ways. It is said that his words will be that of blasphemy, daring to challenge the very authority of heaven itself. While his speeches will sow seeds of rebellion in the hearts of many deemed faithful, only a few would be able to lock out their hearts. As a matter of fact, the telltale sign of the Antichrist identity wouldn't be hidden, as that would be his sole purpose, drive, and reason for his existence. So basically, all believers can do is feed on the word as a counter mechanism against any kind of deceptive words that might come from the Antichrist's mouth. Even at that, it might simply not be enough, as there will be a series of trials for the stern believers in Christ. Apparently, it's also said that the Antichrist would possess the ability to manipulate the economy. This would mean widespread starvation all across the land for everyone. Many will die in their numbers because of lack. Those who might hold on to their faith will end up looking scrawny because of malnourishment. However, God promises that this suffering will only be temporary. Think of it like the story of Job in the Bible. The man did face a series of tribulations, but he held on to his faith. At the end of the day, he was just rewarded by God. He was blessed beyond comprehension. So children of God should think of the tribulations of the Antichrist as a test of faith and nothing more. No doubt, for when the Antichrist will come, Christians will be persecuted on a daily basis all around the world. Not only that, temples and places of worship might be desecrated and destroyed. At some point, you might become wary, looking up in despair and asking for help. However, we must not lose hope. As promised by God and affirmed by Jesus Christ, there will be redemption in the end. Therefore, let us remain unwavering in our commitment to His words. Regardless of the heads up, we need to get fully informed. And so for one who is intentional about arming themselves with the right information, you might ask, how do our modern times compare to the biblical eras? Why would the Antichrist want to make a move now? Well, you are about to find out as we move further in this video. Sit tight. How do modern times compare with the biblical eras, and how does it pave way for the Antichrist? Just as there exists a significant disparity of time between the biblical era and the modern era, so too do these two eras stand in stark contrast to each other. But of course you'd know that, especially if you have an idea of when the Bible was written. As some may know, the Bible was written in stages over the course of the years. The first section, the Old Testament, wasn't finished until the 5th century BC, almost a millennia after the episode of the Israelites in Egypt. It was pretty difficult to come across any copy at the time because it had to be transcribed onto various mediums, such as papyrus and parchment. When we eventually got paper, the Old Testament, which happens to be the sacred scripture of Judaism, had to be reformed by prophets, poets, scribes, and a few others who had gathered knowledge and history in the course of their life journey. Deemed as a special book, the Bible was only accessible to scribes, priests, and scholars who were tasked with the book's preservation and dissemination within the confines of the synagogue. However, by the 1st century AD, a significant shift occurred, marking the beginning of widespread access to the Bible. At the time, Jews began to possess their own copies, and the word of the scriptures had already spread far and wide. You might probably be wondering why we are talking about the Holy Bible. Well, the idea is to drive home a point at the level of spiritual dilapidation in modern times. With the brief narrative of the production of the Bible,
a holy book, more than 1,000 years old, is expected to fetch tens of millions at auction. Sotheby's is selling what's viewed as the oldest and most complete Hebrew Bible ever discovered.
You'd agree that most biblical people were ignorant of the Bible. What this means is that they relied solely on their inbuilt moral values and the guidance of the Holy Spirit to live a godly life. They had no scriptural guidance readily available, except that which was provided to them by the prophets chosen by God. This is completely different from the modern times. Now we have pocket Bibles, Bible apps on our phones, and several simplified translated Bibles readily available anytime we want. However, I have a question for you. Between the biblical era and now, which period do you think comprises people exhibiting greater spiritual decadence? Well, if you and I are being honest, it's our time. This is what paves the way for the arrival of the Antichrist and his cohorts. In the biblical era, prophets were the channels of divine wisdom, providing insight and guidance to the faithful. What's more, they were also known for their miraculous interventions and divine manifestations that served as reminders of God's sovereignty. Today, skepticism and rationalism are casting doubt on the possibility of such heavenly experiences, leaving many spiritually adrift. If that was just the case, the issue wouldn't be so dire. The main thing that's causing a problem is the commonness of sin in our times compared to that of the biblical era. Back in the day, there was a sense of fear as people committed sin, but now it seems like a casual, conventional action. Technological advancements have facilitated the proliferation of sin in various forms, from online scams to explicit content and from same-sex marriage to cyberbullying. Regrettably, rather than diminishing, these acts are increasingly accepted, with some laws even being reformed to accommodate them in society. Day by day, fewer people seem inclined to denounce these behaviors, further perpetuating the moral decay that plagues our modern world. As a matter of fact, there are several theories speculating that if God hadn't upheld the series of promises made in the ancient scriptures of the Bible, the world would likely have met its end, and humanity would have faced extinction due to the height of sin going on in the world presently. If we recall, in Genesis 9:11, God made a pledge to Noah saying, "I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." Also, there is that of Genesis 8:22. God assures us of the stability of the natural order, declaring, "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." When we consider looking at these promises, we can say these pledges and the death of Christ contribute to the extension of the merciful and forgiving side of God. If we are to consider the spiritual decadence of modern times, it just doesn't encourage the coming of the Antichrist, but it poses a huge problem to our spiritual being and our moral integrity. Due to the anonymity of technology, there's no telling who is engaging in one sinful activity or the other, and there's no way to reach out to them individually to share the word and help them desist from their sinful acts. Not to mention the addictive behaviors that are being picked along the line, which further heightens the spiritual challenge that one could be facing. These events provide a level playing field for the Antichrist. The fear by religious leaders is that the harbinger of doom will make good use of technology which is ever available to the generation to reign over the earth. It's said that the Antichrist will take action through the mark of the beast, where he will impose a totalitarian regime, one that is led through fear and deceit. Talking about religious leaders, the highest power of authority of the Roman Catholic, the papacy has some things to say about the Antichrist. Wondering what that is? Let's take a journey to the Vatican in Rome. What do Pope Francis and the papacy have to say about the Antichrist? Are the proofs real? Over the years, a lot has been said by the popes about the Antichrist. For them, very often, they liken the temptations of Jesus in the Testament to the possible ways that the Antichrist will try to alter our course through Christ. Considering the biblical narrative of the temptations of Jesus, Satan's request could easily be interpreted as a kind and accommodating gesture, right? However, all is not as it appears to look. His requests were to entice Jesus into disobedience to God. As crafty as the devil was, he made up temptations to exploit Jesus' vulnerable side at the time. The first temptation was to tempt him to seek sustenance, satisfaction, and relief from hunger, while the second temptation was to test his allure of self-preservation and doubt in God. The third temptation, which is the most enticing, offered dominion over all the kingdoms of the world, challenging Christ's commitment to divine sovereignty. Yet Jesus remained steadfast, resisting each temptation. The same can't be said for everyone in modern times. It's safe to say that more than half of the population of the world would fall for their heart desires in the blink of an eye. depicting a spiritually weak populace. And so the Pope is warning against any kind of spiritual relaxation, urging Christians to hold steadfast now more than ever to ward off the Antichrist. With these words of encouragement from the Pope, does it mean that the Antichrist is here? Well, not yet, at least. While the Church has paid attention to these signs, there has been no confirmation whatsoever as to the presence of the Antichrist. Instead, these signs have been acknowledged as a possible scheme by the disciples of the Antichrist in preparation for his arrival. That said, you should know that the emergence of the Antichrist is closer than we thought. Aside from the incessant talks about the Antichrist, you must have also heard about the anticipated arrival of the Messiah. It is said that he will be the opposite figure of the Antichrist, leading the flock of believers into the heavenly fold. As a matter of fact, different religious sects have their views on who they believe to be the Messiah. For example, within Judaism, there exists a spectrum of interpretations regarding the identity of the Messiah, with some expecting a unifier who will gather exiles and rebuild the temple. The conception of Jesus Christ as the Messiah doesn't neatly align with Jewish monotheistic beliefs, as they feel he didn't fulfill the expected roles outlined in their scriptures. This is completely different for the Christians. He, who they look up to as the Messiah, is none other than Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who once came to deliver the world from sin. It's said that he will come again, but this time to render the Antichrist and his cohorts completely powerless. Just as there are expectations of someone playing a major role in the arrival of the Antichrist, Christians speculate about an individual who might play a role in ushering in the Messiah, with some considering the Pope as a potential figure in this scenario. It's said that Pope Francis might be the one to hand over the reins of the Church to the Messiah, fulfilling the duties of the Church since the beginning of times. This is the point at which believers will be ushered into eternal life. However, that's not all that's being said about Pope Francis. Apparently, there are people with the belief that Pope Francis himself is a precursor to the Antichrist. This line of thought came up at the time when Pope Benedict XVI announced his resignation as Pope. During that time, lightning struck the Vatican in Rome, making it seem like we were taking a step into apocalyptic times. Was that a coincidence? Pope Benedict doesn't think so. In the same period, he wrote a letter to a Catholic statesman by the name of Vladimir Palko concerning the state of the Church. In his letter, Pope Benedict said, "We see how the power of Antichrist is expanding, and we can only pray the Lord will give us strong shepherds who will defend his church in this hour of need from the power of evil." This was Pope Benedict's way of warning the church for what was to come, but he in no way pointed out his successor as the Antichrist. It's most likely because the letter was written in 2015, when he had already resigned, and Pope Francis was the Pope, gave people the impression that he was referring to the current papacy. If there's one thing we know, it is that the Church has been fighting the Antichrist for decades non-stop. However, that doesn't make them impregnable to the attacks of the Antichrist. After all, when we consider the tenure and arrival of Pope Francis, it's clear that his papacy has not been without its blemishes. For one, he is from the Jesuit order, a body in the Church that has faced countless criticisms and controversies since its formation. It's said that this order exercised power using undue influence, completely disregarding the traditional Catholic teachings and ethics. As a matter of fact, this same order has had several clashes with other orders in the Church due to different theological views. The order posited the identities of all the popes till the end of the 16th century. They believe that the last pope will be referred to as Peter the Roman, and he will reside throughout tribulation within the Church. Let's say we decide not to judge the book by its cover. There's still The Vision by Blessed Catherine Emmerich. In her vision, she said, "I saw the Holy Father in great distress. He was praying fervently for the Church, and I saw a great darkness descending upon him. Then before him appeared a figure representing the Church, adorned in splendor but surrounded by darkness and turmoil. The Holy Father reached out to embrace the Church, but she was unresponsive, as if paralyzed by fear and confusion. In that moment I heard a voice saying, 'The Church will pass through a time of great trial and purification, but she will emerge stronger and more radiant than ever before.'" Interpreting her vision, many have come to accept the apostate theory, which is that the Antichrist will emerge right from the church. So does that seal the identity of the Pope? Not at all. It's true that there have been many prophecies concerning the 112th Pope and his links to the end times, but that doesn't confirm the allegations levied against him. Nobody is taking away the fact that the several reformations of the policies of the Church point to a sinister force at play. The only thing we are saying is that it's way too early to point fingers at the head of the Church. What are you meant to do? Well, your duty as a Christian is to pray for the Church. The Antichrist might not be here yet, but his spirit is already creating the way for his arrival. With the popularity of artificial intelligence, he could take the form of an AI system, easily reaching out to people all around the globe in milliseconds. Not just that, the Antichrist could also come in the form of a globally influential political leader, one capable of reforming laws as he pleases. Daniel 7:23 says he will promise peace from global wars, only to lead people away from God. Aside from that, he would be rich and capable of providing for the masses, only to have them sell their souls to the devil. And so the Pope cautions believers on the need to be wary and ever ready. He also preaches the need for believers and non-believers to come together in these trying times and help build the faith of the latter group. This is the only way we can win the fight against the Antichrist. If there's one weapon we have at our disposal, it is the Scriptures. For when men lie and become deceptive to lure believers into the fold of the Antichrist, the Bible would be the only truth existing in the world. It's enough to guide each and every believer till when the Messiah comes for his people. Thanks for watching. Remember, let's try not to brew up confusion about all we see in these trying times. As Christians, we must lead, spreading love and unity, acts that are completely void of what the Antichrist represents. Stay safe out there.